Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating source that argues there's a hidden structure to our economy, an intentional design that it actually calls the architecture of inequality.
Right off the bat, the whole argument kicks off with this incredibly provocative statement. The source is basically claiming that for some people to have great wealth, it's no accident that others have very little. This is the central puzzle we're going to unpack today.
And here's our roadmap for how we're going to do it. We'll start with this idea of wealth as a zero-sum game, then get into the philosophical question of what a decent life even is. After that, we'll break society down into 4 key elements, see how they create an engine of power, and finally, bring it all together to really understand what the source means by an architecture of inequality.
So let's start with that core claim. The source frames wealth not as a bigger pie that can just keep growing for everyone, but as a system that by design has fixed winners and losers. The very structure, it argues, requires that for a few to be extremely rich, many others must necessarily be poor.
Now, that is a bold claim, and it rests on a deep philosophical foundation. And you know what? It all starts with a seemingly simple question about what it actually means for us to live a good life. The source suggests that our entire economic system gets its power from how tough this question is to answer. Think about it. If we can't all agree on a universal standard for what a decent life looks like, it becomes way easier to justify the massive gaps in wealth we see all around us.
And here's the key. The argument used against setting some kind of universal standard is the idea of natural human differences. The source claims the system really leans into this idea, that we're all so different in our minds and bodies that a single standard for a decent life is just impossible. This idea is presented as the very bedrock of the entire structure.
So, to really get how this works, the source deconstructs society into 4 core components. Let's take a look at each of them one by one. These are the 4 building blocks of the whole argument: our natural differences, our sense of individuality, our innate need for interdependence or social cohesion, and finally, the organizing force of power. First up, differences. The source treats this as just a simple natural fact. We're all varied. Of course we are. But in this system, these natural variations get turned into a tool for comparison, a way to rank people, especially when it comes to social and financial status. Second is individuality. This is our sense of self, our ego. The text points out that this is often framed as being in a constant battle against the group. You know, that classic tension of the individual versus society. And the natural flip side to individuality is interdependence or social cohesion. This is the simple reality that we're social creatures. We live together. It's the force that creates unity and connection. It's the glue. Now, what's really interesting here is how the source contrasts these 2 forces. It argues that the system actively promotes individuality among the masses, which creates separation, and at the exact same time, it claims our social cohesion, that powerful sense of connection, is deliberately weakened. And that brings us to the 4th and final element, power. The source defines power not just as being in charge, but as the active, organizing force in society. You can almost think of it as the director of the show, managing the other 3 elements, differences, individuality, and cohesion, to keep the whole structure pointing in one specific direction. So we have the 4 parts. Now let's see how they're all put together. Because these elements don't just sit there in isolation. The source argues they interact to create a powerful, dynamic engine. And this chart illustrates the core dynamic brilliantly. According to the text, the greater the economic and social differences in a society, the stronger that organizing force of power becomes. Small differences correspond to a low concentration of power, while large differences, well, they actively fuel its growth. So the crucial point is how this happens. The process described goes like this. First, the masses are encouraged to focus on their individuality. This naturally weakens broader social cohesion. Now, while the general population becomes more fragmented, the internal cohesion of the small group in power actually gets stronger. The result? A small, highly connected group can easily dominate a large, disconnected population. And now we can bring the entire argument full circle to see how this engine produces what the source calls an intentional architecture of inequality. The final structure, then, looks like this. A small, unified group defined as power is sustained and held up by a large, fragmented population that has been encouraged to focus on individual concerns over collective ones. It's me over we. The source wraps up with this powerful image to describe the human cost of this whole system. The economic logic is that the wealth and position of the few are built directly upon the efforts and sacrifices of the many.
And that leaves us with one final provocative question. If our economy truly is a deliberate architecture, as this source argues, then the most important question isn't just how it was built, but whether we have the will to redesign it.